Hello, everybody. My name's Caroline Wickham-Jones, and I'm an archaeologist. I live and work in Orkney and around the rest of Scotland. I've been working in Scottish archaeology for an awful long time. And the thing that really fascinates me is the earliest groups who came to Scotland at the end of the last ice age and the way in which they were living. And that sort of archaeology has really changed hugely throughout my career. We've just got to know so much more about it. And what I wanted to talk to today is just a little bit about how people might have lived in these very early times, because obviously it's long before any of the home comforts that we take for granted. People had to get what they needed from the world around them. And it's quite fun sometimes just to look at how people might have done that. So I'm just getting used to moving on my images. Yeah, there we go. So we're going to be traveling back in time over the next 45 minutes or so. We're going to be traveling back in time some 10,000 years to the period after the end of the last great ice age. And this is a slide with an awful lot of information on it. It's really one for you to pause the presentation and to look at in detail. I'm not going to take you through everything that's on the slide, but it tries to set the scene for what's been going on in Britain in the millennia leading up to the last ice age. And it gives you a little bit of an idea of when there's been ice, when there hasn't been ice, periods when Britain's been joined to the continent, periods when Britain's been an island, some of the main archaeological terms like Neolithic, Mesolithic, and so on, and one or two of the sort of type sites from that period. So it's really a slide to come back to. The periods that I'm largely talking about are the millennia presented in green on the slide. And if we go back to the beginning of this period, Scotland was really very, very different to the Scotland that we all know and love today. To start with, it was covered by ice sheets, and there have been times where those ice sheets would have covered the whole of the land. But because I'm interested in the people who move into the country, I'm kind of looking at a period perhaps as the ice is starting to retreat, and then at the period after that. So for this particular picture, I've chosen one where you've got, yes, a great glacier or ice sheet, but you've got a few mountains sticking up out of it. And that's the sort of scene that you might have been able to experience had you been able to come into Scotland at the time. And of course, when I say Scotland was a very different place, that's not just environment, but that's also geographically. That at this period, right at the end of the last ice age, and indeed for the first few thousand years afterwards, Scotland, or Britain indeed, was part of the continental landmass. It wasn't a separate island. Rather, it was a peninsula off the north coast, off the northwest coast of Europe. Now, for quite a lot of this time, it's likely that Doggerland was covered by ice. And of course, that's partly why it's a peninsula, because so much water from around the surface of the earth is taken up into those great ice sheets that global sea levels fell. It's a complicated picture. It's also to do with the weight of ice pushing the land down. But towards the end of the last ice age, as the ice retreated, you have still an ice cap over Scandinavia, you have some ice cover over parts of Scotland, but it leaves behind a landscape, the landscape of Doggerland, which of course would have melded seamlessly into the landscape of the United Kingdom, of Scotland and England as we know it today. And that gives you a landscape that's ripe for animals to move into it, great herds of reindeer, smaller animals and so on. And of course, where you have animals going hot on their heels, you're going to have human groups. And that's the time when we get these first exploratory groups moving into Scotland. And if you're interested in that, I'm not going to go into any more detail today, but have a look at the Lost Frontiers project at Bradford University. They've got a Facebook page and various other web pages and things, and they're looking at the history of Doggerland, at the way in which the landscape slowly inundated as sea levels rose. They're looking at the types of plants, at the topography of the land, at the climate and at the animals. And of course, the ultimate goal is to try and get information about the human population there. So it's a very interesting project. Now, the first communities to explore Scotland in this late Ice Age world, these groups are groups of Stone Age hunter-gatherers. And the technical term that we know them by is Paleolithic. Of course, we don't know what they would have called themselves. But they're really moving out from continental Europe. They're nomadic groups, possibly in a round that may have taken place over a year, might even have taken place across several years. They have territories, they understand the land, they understand where the resources are. They're also explorers. They're moving into a new world as the ice sheets disappear and as the climate becomes better. Now, these groups are nomadic groups, and really they leave very little footprint on the land, just a few classic stone tools, often pieces that we've interpreted as spear points. And here you can see on screen a photograph of one that's come from Nethermills Farm alongside the River Dee. So something that's very familiar to those of you who are accustomed to come out and work with Mesolithic Deeside. We've not found very many places where we have much more evidence than just maybe a handful of stone tools. There's one or two sites with a little bit more evidence of a settlement site, but we've only really just started looking for these sites. So it's something that's quite exciting. I don't think when I started out in archaeology, I would never have thought that our understanding would still be expanding decades later, but it is, which is really nice. Now, as the ice receded and conditions improved across the country, we move into the period that is known geologically as the Holocene. And what you find there is that the communities, the groups who are living in Scotland, they become a bit more permanent. They're settling into sort of fixed territories, if you like. And their technology changes. One of the big changes that we see is the introduction of the bow. We see a lot of very small flint arrowheads, other sorts of changes coming about. Group size perhaps get a bit bigger, population grows a little bit. And we call these people who are living in Scotland at the time, we call them Mesolithic. And you can see a reconstruction of a fairly typical Mesolithic campsite on the screen there. And really, that's what I want to talk about a little bit more today. And I put this picture up just to give you an idea of just how productive a landscape can be as the ice retreats. You can see snow-capped mountains, you can see a glacier in the background. This is from Alaska, and it's a photograph that I took many years ago, but you can see it's still a very cold landscape. There are icebergs in the water there. You've got a big kind of meltwater, deltaic braided river system coming down, but you can also see the forestry, you can see meadows. This sort of area is a very rich area to hunt. It's got lots of resources, berries and so on, for people who might want to come and occupy these sorts of areas. So while you might not live here round the year, you might not live here permanently, it's by no means the case that the area alongside an ice front is uninhabitable. In fact, there's a whole range of resources which people were able to make use of. However, when we're looking today at the archaeological evidence for Mesolithic Scotland, it really doesn't look like much. People were still treading very lightly on the surface of the ground. And so very often the sort of evidence that they're leaving behind them might just be a few discolorations in the soil, pits and post holes, perhaps the odd hearth site, collection of charcoal if you're lucky, and the ubiquitous scatters of stone tools, and you'll be seeing some of those later on. So of course you have to understand that what the archaeologist does, the job of the archaeologist, is to move from the reality to interpret the dream. And that's really what I've been trying to pick up in this illustration. Now, the evidence may be elusive, but as we come to understand it better, we realize that there are many, many recorded find spots of Mesolithic material across Scotland. And this map shows you only a few of them. It shows you the principal Mesolithic find spots and only find spots that have been validated, where some sort of archaeological workers maybe looked at the stone tools or something and said, yes, those are classic Mesolithic arrowheads. But it gives you an idea of the way in which this settlement, it covers the whole of Scotland. You can see many, many of the sites are coastal. I think that's largely because it's easier to find a site in a coastal area. There's long been a big debate as to whether people were mainly living along the coast. I think it's more because we just haven't got very good at looking for sites in the inland and upland areas. And as we start to do that and develop more expertise, you can see there are now dots beginning to move into the Cairngorms, for example, some of our upland areas. So people are really covering the whole of the country, and I'm sure there's many, many more sites to go and find out. So what about the lifestyle? Well, it's a very sophisticated lifestyle, but in a way which perhaps takes a little bit of understanding to acknowledge and recognize. People are moving round the landscape, they're making use of all the different resources, but also there was a certain amount of understanding that if they used up the resources in any one area, that wasn't great for the future. And so it's not to say that people were totally ecological. It's not a Garden of Eden by any means. But by and large, people are staying a short time in one place, taking what they need and moving on. And it's a very kind of fluid idea of community. You might have some periods of the year where quite a big community with several families come together. You might then have periods where families split up into smaller groups, or you might have indeed peer groups going off. You might have all the young folk going off into the hills to hunt deer and look for sources of stone. You might have certain section of the community might go to the shore to look for shellfish, or some people might stay at home. So in fact, while some sites are possibly even occupied permanently on a year-round basis, other sites are very much more temporary. Other sites are transitory, with people just coming in and out of them. But essentially, these are people just like us. They've got the same basic needs that we have. So what we have to do is to look at the landscape in which they lived and think about how they could fulfill those needs and what the archaeological evidence suggests. And as I say, you have very fluid communities. So sometimes we've tended to use fairly sort of ethnographic names. We talk about base camps, hunting camps. These are all interpretations that we put on things. But in areas where we have quite a lot of sites, such as here in the west coast of Scotland, people like Stephen Mython and his colleagues from the University of Reading, they've worked to suggest how sites in fact might relate to one another and how they might build into a whole system, perhaps looking at how a particular group of people, a clan if you like, would have worked together and how the sites might have been created. So I'm going to start just by running through some of these basic needs, looking at what the archaeological evidence suggests, how they might have been fulfilled. And of course, one of the first things you're going to want to do is to build yourself a shelter. Well, the archaeological evidence suggests a variety of types of structure. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see a plan of the site that was excavated many, many years ago on the island of Rum, where we had various arcs of stake holes suggesting rounded structures, probably built using the local woodland, covered perhaps by hides or by grass or bark or something. You can also see in the bottom of that plan possibly evidence of a more angular sort of structure. And there is evidence from other sites of that everything wasn't always circular. But on the right-hand side, you can see a plan from a few sites where we've got structural evidence, just showing you some of the variety in that sort of evidence. But very often it does tend to be circular in nature. But of course, that's quite difficult, because once we get the idea that the shelters are circular, then of course we're always looking for circular structures. And in archaeology, you have to be very, very careful that you don't bias your results in that sort of a way. So here at Ettlin Fields, South Queensferry, a site that was excavated by headland archaeology in advance of the third crossing of the Forth, we have evidence of a very nice, in fact, quite a robust circular structure. And it has been suggested that sites like this, houses like this, might in fact have been occupied on a year-round basis, because there's some evidence of repair, and it's a sort of larger, more robust sort of structure. Of course, there are instances, if you look ethnographically around the world, where people were building structures like this, but they weren't occupying them year-round. They were maybe using them for a bit, then leaving, but leaving the structure in good order so that when they returned, they'd got somewhere to use straight away. So I think we need to be careful. We need to keep all our interpretations quite nuanced. And life wasn't all about these big, robust structures. Of course, the more fragile something is in archaeology, the more difficult it is to get evidence of it. But we have got evidence of less big, less robust things. For example, here in Fife, under one of the golf courses, where we found evidence some years ago, again excavated by headland archaeology, for what is interpreted much more as just a windbreak, perhaps associated with the processing of foods in the autumn, when you tend to get a glut of resources and you might be trying to build up some supplies for the winter. So this, I think you can see it's a much smaller structure, much more ephemeral, really. And some reconstructions. One of the things that's really come on in archaeology in the last 2 or 3 decades has been experimental archaeology, trying to see what some of this archaeological evidence might look like if we reconstructed it, what we can learn from it. And you can see here a couple of different solutions to these circles of post holes. On the left, a Sami structure, in this case covered with a tarpaulin, but it might well be covered with hides or something. And on the right, a structure from North America made using bark. And other sorts of things. And just thinking about the resources needed. Scotland at the time, fairly abundant woodland. You need quite tall, straight-growing trees to build any sort of structure. In some places, it's possible that as people moved on, they would have dismantled the structure. Here's some posts left waiting for the next people to arrive at a site. Your structures don't have to be pointed, they can be round. You can see the framework here for a rounded structure. And then you have to ask yourself what the archaeological evidence would look like. And here's a site where one of these structures has been uplifted, ready to move on, taken to pieces. And really, the archaeological footprint, after a few years, in fact, would leave very, very little trace, just perhaps burnt ground, a bit of charcoal in the middle. So it's very interesting to try these sorts of things. It gets you thinking about the archaeology that you're finding in a very different sort of a way. And structures don't just have to be out in the open. They don't just have to be built out of timber. There's lots of other ways, of course, of getting shelter. In Scotland, we've got a lot of rock shelters, cliffs and caves and so on, and plenty of evidence of people making use of those. So here at Sand in Applecross over on the west coast, where an excavation a few years ago uncovered good evidence for people living in the rock shelter, making use of the surrounding resources about 7,500 years ago, and a reconstruction drawing. So we're not always looking at built structures. Sometimes we're looking at making use of available structures, available natural shelter. And moving on from shelter, well, that perhaps the next thing is the hearth and home, fire, needing some warmth. I mean, a lot of these things really are just basic bushcraft skills. But here you've got a sort of reconstruction and then some different technique for making fire, in this case using a bow drill with an upright which you turn in order to have friction, which will of course produce heat, and using the build-up of charcoal to generate a little bit of a spark and fire, putting that to a tinder fungus, and then into some dried grass. And pretty quickly, you can have a good hearth going. You will, of course, already have placed handily somewhere a good supply of wood, of different types of wood that will catch fire easily, bring on a good flame, and then wood that will burn slower and longer. I think some of this use of different types of wood is something that we've very much lost in our society today. And we have to kind of bring that to bear when we're thinking of some of the traces of life in the past. And coming forward to something a bit more familiar to anyone who goes out and field walks, the stone tools. Well, everyday objects. What were the sort of, what was the material culture of these people? And of course, the one thing that you instantly think about are stone tools, often called flints, because flint is one of the main stones that is in use, although people were really making use of a whole variety of flakeable stones across Scotland. So you get stone tools made of chert and quartz and chalcedonies, all sorts of different things. But you can see the basic techniques at the bottom, cracking open a nodule of flint, carefully working it by peeling flakes down the side of it. It's really just a controlled way of breaking glass, if you like, using a variety of different hammers to get different strengths, different force into your blow. In fact, using antler and even wood hammers as well as stone. You can see some stone hammers from the Mesolithic up at the top of the picture. And in the middle, you can see some of the nice fine flint blades. These have very, very sharp edges. There's always an anecdote told about how the edges of a flint blade are sharper than the edges of your average kitchen knife, because they're actually flaked along the molecular structure of the stone. They're not ground down. But you don't just have to use the sharp edges. You can also alter the shapes of those stone. You can shape the edges. You can blunt them, turn them into a whole variety of different tools, useful for scraping, for working vegetable matter, all different sorts of things. Sharpness isn't the only attribute you want in your stone tools. Different types of stone in use, as I've said, and a lot of the time you can pick up the stones that you need, particularly from beaches, river gravels, also outcrops up in the hills, perhaps when you're up there gathering berries or hunting animals. You also know where to find good sources of stone. And people have been doing this for millennia, for generations. They knew exactly how to live. So you can see a nice nodule, big nodule of rum bloodstone there in the top picture, just picked up from the slopes of the hills in Rum, and some rather nice blades and things from flint knapping in the other pictures. And as I say, it's not just about blades. One of the characteristic tools of the Mesolithic are these tiny, tiny shaped pieces. We call them microliths. We call the process of shaping them retouching. And they're just little composite tools. If you like, they're the penknife blades of prehistory. You'd have used several of them, and you'd have inserted them into slots in a wooden haft, for example, to make an arrowhead, or setting them a slightly different way to make a knife blade, that sort of thing. They're really characteristic of the Mesolithic. And where you find a lot of them, it's a really good indication that there's been Mesolithic activity, probably a campsite, perhaps people out hunting, stopping to reshape, to sharpen, to repair their toolkit. But the other picture down at the bottom is just give you also a reminder that there's other types of stone tool. These are pieces of pumice stone, which have been used for shaping and straightening arrowheads and needles, and really anything where you need a long, fine point. So you can use these really as grinding slabs to pull a bone point or something through to shape it. So it's not just about flaking stone, there are other types of stone, and these are just as important. And of course, as I say, we recognize Mesolithic sites often on the basis of the fact that there are stone tools there, and that we can pick up very often on a Mesolithic site. You can pick up hundreds of stone tools on the surface of the ground, perhaps just a square metre of a ploughed field. You might get 30 or 40 or even more just on the surface. So the stone tools are a really good indication to us today that something's happened in the past. But in many ways, that shows that the stone is important for us. But if you'd lived in the Mesolithic, it's very likely that the stone, you wouldn't have regarded it as quite so significant, because there were a whole range of other materials, of other goods that made up your everyday life. And so although we call it the Stone Age, I often think that people in the past might have actually been quite amused at that. You know, it's a bit like in any of our houses here, we're going to have lots of ballpoint pens, but actually we never think about them as being a kind of defining artifact of the 21st century. And in some ways, I think you have to think about stone tools like that. So what else could you have made tools out of? Well, one of the best materials, one of the prime materials, is bone and antler. And I think we have to be very aware that when people went out hunting, they weren't just going for food, they were going for an animal which provided a whole range of resources, and nothing would be wasted. And indeed, it's very likely that on many sites, there were deposits of bones and antler and things that would be building up so that when you needed to make something, you could go and find the raw material that you needed. And here there's just a quick cartoon to take you through making a harpoon head, and in fact, some pictures of the same sort of process. So using a sharp stone, a flint or other point to cut out of your antler, what we'd call a groove and splinter technique, to cut out a splinter of roughly the right size, and then shaping it, grinding it down with that piece of pumice, using sinew and resin, or perhaps a bit of fibre drawn from the local woodland or whatever, to bind it to a haft, and then you're all set to go. So these sorts of things are the sort of skills that if you'd grown up in the Mesolithic, you would have seen them happening all around you all the time. Other types of stone tools here, making a tool for scraping, a hide scraping tool. We often, if you work with archaeologists, you'll hear them talking about scrapers, about flint scrapers, stone scrapers, and we tend to think of scrapers as being used on hides, but it's not just stone. There's lots of other things. And in fact, sometimes stone isn't that great for working on a hide because you can accidentally damage it and cut into it. So sometimes you want a much blunter tool, and something like this with just a few little notches to try and get as much of the fat as you can off, and also at the same time to be working and softening that hide. And other organic materials, of course, exist. We've mentioned wood, and there's all sorts of uses for a range of woods, but things like birch bark, which you can peel from the tree without killing the tree. You can separate it, you can peel off the outer layer. At certain times of the year, it's very flexible. You can heat it up slightly to improve the flexibility, fold it into all sorts of shapes. And I always have quite liked this picture up on the top right of the screen, because really, this picture, it shows a range of artifacts that might, well, the sort of thing that might have been used in the Mesolithic. But the only archaeological evidence, the only thing that would survive is the little stone sinker. I don't know if you can see it dangling from the fishing line. The fishing line itself is made from a root. It's got a little juniper hook at one end. You can see the fishing rod leaning against the tree, but it would be very, very difficult for any archaeologist to reconstruct that sort of thing from the sort of evidence that by and large survives in Scotland today. You'd need some of the fantastic sites around the Baltic where they have waterlogged conditions, where these sorts of things survive much better. And indeed, it's from sites like that that we can do some of our reconstructions. And larger wooden tools, of course, here using juniper to make a bow and making arrows, fletched with feathers with little stone tips, although you might also have just the wooden tip, a blunt tip, very useful if you're out hunting birds because you want to bring them down, but you don't want to damage the plumage and things. So a whole range of sizes of artifact that can be made from the different resources around about you in the forests of Scotland. And moving on, well, we've seen a picture of the hide, and we can think perhaps about clothing. Now, if you look at any reconstruction of life in the Stone Age, of life in the Mesolithic, you'll see the people wearing clothes, often quite tailored clothes. And indeed, there's no reason why they wouldn't have had clothes made of hide, and why they certainly would have had the wherewithal and the ability to cut clothes and to make slightly more tailored, fitted clothes and things. They're not just looping a hide around them or anything. But I think we also just have to think about our preconceptions and to ask ourselves, are we 100% certain that people wore clothes? What would be the archaeological evidence for clothes? And there are societies, I mean, you might say, well, in our climate, clothes would be a necessity. But there have been societies elsewhere in the world where in climates just as bad as the climate in Scotland, you had groups who very rarely wore clothes. And I've just put up a little picture. This is from the 1920s. It's very much a cartoon, stereotypical. It's from down in Patagonia, in Tierra del Fuego, of a group who really, by and large, didn't use much clothing. And so I think despite the fact that they certainly experienced a climate just as bad, just as cold, just as wet as ours, it just reminds us that we need to be very careful when we're making some of our assumptions. I think one of the things that was an issue down in Tierra del Fuego was that these very hides that people are using to make their clothing of, well, hide is great. It's very supple, it's very flexible. You can do all sorts of things with it. But when it gets wet, then it loses its flexibility. As anybody who's worked with hide will know, if you get caught outside, you suddenly find yourself wearing clothes that aren't nearly as comfortable as what you thought. So if you're in an area with very high precipitation, maybe hide clothes aren't as great as all that, because you actually would have to rework them in order to get back the suppleness. And the other thing is, if you're caught out and you end up wearing very wet clothes, well, that's a quick route to hypothermia. We know that today. The sort of common lesson about not wearing your denim jeans to go out hill walking because they get waterlogged, they're very difficult to dry off. These applied to people in the past. So certainly down in Patagonia, in a climate in very wet seasons when there's very high precipitation, people were adapting to other methods of surviving in very wet weather, and wearing clothes wasn't such a useful thing as might at first seem. So sometimes we need to challenge our preconceptions. And moving on from that, talking about hunting and moving on to food. And again, I must say, I do just like these. They're from, they're kind of like OXO cube cards from the 1920s. And I just rather like them for the dreadful colonial views that they promote. But these are all down from Tierra del Fuego again. I think the thing that we can start to think about in Mesolithic Scotland, yes, there's a variety of resources. It's a rich country. There's resources of the coast, there's resources of inland. When you see people writing, when you see archaeological texts about life in the Mesolithic, they tend to focus on large game, on red deer hunters, reindeer hunters, if you go back a bit further in time, and so on. And it's true that we get plenty of evidence where we are lucky enough to find organic material, where we have middens and so on. We get plenty of evidence for the importance of animals such as red deer, of large mammals, to the societies at the time. But it's important to remember that there's a whole range of other things that very likely the majority of any single person's calories would not have come from large game, that what keeps a community going is often a whole range of different types of resources. And I think it's very important that we as archaeologists don't get too caught up with the idea of the reindeer hunters, the deer hunters, whatever, because people are doing a whole lot of other things as well. Lots of resources here, just a fairly typical kind of autumnal suite of resources, berries, hazelnuts, fungi, but at other times of the other things, roots, leaves, at the moment, wild garlic, all these sorts of things. Of course, a lot of what we're used to today has been imported into Britain. There are things that, like ground elder, for example, imported as a salad crop, I think about a millennia, maybe 2,000 years ago. So not available to your Mesolithic hunters. But there are plenty of roots and shoots and other vegetable resources that can be made use of. And believe me, people would have known exactly, seaweeds and so on, what was available, what they could eat. And moving to the shore, talking of seaweed, fish, a big resource. There's evidence both for inshore fish, there's some evidence for offshore fish, some slight debate about fishing techniques and things, but certainly we know that people are using boats at the time, so there's no reason why they wouldn't be able to venture out and fish in deeper waters. Different ways of preserving fish, whether you're smoking them, whether you're eating them as soon as you catch them, shellfish, eggs, birds, all sorts of resources around the coastlines and cliffs of the country. And groups, when they came to the coast, would be making full use of these. And just moving back to the mammals, well, mammals' meat doesn't have to come as a large mammal. It can also be small mammals, here the edible dormouse. So very much people, perhaps children, going out hunting different types of birds and animals, with none of the hang-ups that we have today about, say, getting a sparrow if you happen to be hungry. If that's the easiest bird to hunt, that's what you'll go for. And so really a very varied diet, making use of what's available at different times of the year, what's available in different locations. It's an interesting thing I've often thought and would like to kind of look at a bit more is what evidence we have for storage, because my feeling is that kind of ideas of famine and long-term hunger, that these tend to become much more prevalent once you have farming, once you kind of put your harvest into much more of a regimented certain times of the year. If you're a Mesolithic community, I think there's nearly always something to support you somewhere, even if it means that you can't support such a big community that you have to separate out, move to areas where there are smaller resources available and things. I think there's nearly always something to keep you going. And I've wondered what the kind of archaeological evidence for food storage might be. I know there are people beginning to think about this, how we would recognize food storage in the early archaeological record, I think is a very interesting conundrum. And then, as I say, preparation of the food, butchery. Again, we talk about, as I was saying, we talk about stone scrapers and things. With most larger mammals, the hide will actually just peel off because it's separated by a layer of fat, and it's relatively easy if you know what you're doing. And believe me, these people knew what they're doing in a way that we can never approach. So skinning an animal isn't that difficult. And butchering it, again, if you know what you're doing, if you do this sort of thing habitually, it's not surprising that the fantastic Paleolithic cave art in Europe, that it shows muscle attachments, it shows the insides of animals very, very minutely, because these are people who had to butcher their own animals, who had to butcher their own meat in order to survive. They knew exactly where the muscles were, what muscle joined what muscles made the legs work and things, in a way that those of us who get our meat from butcher shops or supermarkets, we're just totally removed from. So I think sometimes we kind of express archaeological amazement at things that really aren't that amazing. And like I say, storage, cooking, all sorts of things. If you go out and if you are lucky enough to bring down a red deer or so on, you get a lot of meat. And unless you're living in quite a large group, you're probably not going to make use of all that meat at the same time. So you might want to dry and smoke some of it. And here you can see meat being prepared and hung up on a rack over a very smoky fire made using damp logs and things, in order to smoke it and dry it for consumption later on. You can also see meat being cooked in different ways, in a birch bark trough with water, hot stones being put into it. It'll boil the water almost instantly. If you cover it and use lots of sphagnum moss to build up some insulation around it, you'll end up with cooked meat in there. Or you might just want to lay your meat in a pit in the ground, perhaps with hot stones or ashes and things, cook it in a different way. There's lots of different ways of cooking that perhaps start to suggest how some of the little pits and misshapen hollows and things that we find on archaeological sites, how some of these features might start to build up. And moving around the landscape, I've talked a lot about the way in which people are moving from one area to another to make use of resources, how different groups, perhaps sometimes large groups, sometimes smaller groups, might have moved around. And we have to think of Scotland, by and large, its country, it's got much more woodland, but it's also got open areas. Well, the first thing to say is that when you're traveling around a landscape like that, actually it's much easier to travel along the watercourses. And I think this is one of the reasons that we tend to find so many sites along the great rivers. Whether people are actually traveling on the water, we know they've got watercraft, they're going out to islands and so on, or whether they're traveling along the banks of the water. You know where you are along the waterway, you can orientate yourself, you've got the constant flow of the water, you've got landmarks that you will very quickly come to know. And people will no doubt have preserved maps of journeys in their head, perhaps telling stories about events that happened along the way, so that when they do have to leave the watercourse, perhaps to move into the uplands, to cross an upland pass or whatever, they can recognize the features in the landscape. In lower areas, moving through the woodland, it can be much more difficult. You don't have to be in very dense woodland to fairly quickly lose any idea of orientation. If it's not a particularly sunny day, you can't work out where the sun is, the wind will be going over the tops of your heads. One of the interesting things is that when you look at some of the earlier ethnographic accounts, or even 19th century ethnographic accounts, where European groups are moving into areas where there are already groups have been living for millennia, one of the things that the Europeans often talk about is the way in which people will move through woodland along recognized paths, but the Europeans can't see the paths. It looks just like native woodland. And so I think we have to be, again, very careful of imagining that we might actually have pathways through Mesolithic Scotland. We might not. It might just look like a natural landscape. And yet to those who live there, who know the land, they know that if you move from that particular rock in this particular direction, or following the way the land lies or whatever, it will bring you to another place. The maps are in people's heads, and they're told through the use of story and through a really intimate knowledge of the land, not just through open vistas and recognizable marks on the surface of the land in the way that we do today, in the way that we might imagine. And of course, the ubiquitous put up water transport. The fires are authentic in this particular group down in Tierra del Fuego, although they probably didn't have quite such vigorous flames. But this group of people are interesting because they actually lived much more time on the water than they did on land. So they're very, very skilled, very habituated to living on the waves, although in fact their boats were particularly flimsy and only lasted for 2 or 3 years. They had to reconstruct the boats, which are made with a certain type of local tree bark. They had to rebuild and repair boats every 2 or 3 years. But it's interesting just to realize that there were groups of people for whom being on the land, on solid land, wasn't quite the necessity that we see it as today. There were groups for whom the water was just as much somewhere where they could feel at home and be comfortable. And what I thought I would do is just run through a little bit of the sort of archaeological evidence. This is all evidence that comes from the west of Scotland, because I thought for those of you who've come into this lecture through Mesolithic Deeside, you're very, very familiar with the River Dee and with the types of sites that are coming up along the Dee. And if I just showed you half a dozen pictures of the sorts of sites that are coming up elsewhere, that might help you to put the Deeside into a kind of wider context, plus looking at these landscapes and thinking about the resources and the way that people were living. So if we go right back to the very, very first settlers, now these people, they've not only got to get to Scotland, they've got to get round to the west of Scotland. So perhaps they're moving along the shores of Doggerland, perhaps they're coming across country. I'm using for this lecture the phases that, again, Stephen Mython, who's worked in the West, he's drawn up, looking at population and relating it to environment and things. And he sees the first phase as being very much an exploratory phase, perhaps lasting from about 12,000 to just before 9,000 years ago. And he sees it as being a phase of probably short-term visits, perhaps people not living in the area permanently, certainly not at first, perhaps ranging widely around Scotland, or in fact travelling over from elsewhere, perhaps even just travelling across Scotland occasionally. And you've got sites like this site on Islay at Ruther Porsensilach, where he's excavated a very early site on the shores of the Sound of Islay looking across to Jura. And you can see really in common with all your Mesolithic sites, it's not the sort of site with glitzy archaeology. It's much more about atmosphere, about dropping the landscape back to 12,000 years ago or so. And then coming forward in time from about 9,500 years ago up to about 7,800 years ago, community, population size growing, communities increasing, settling into more fixed territories with a selection of sites, perhaps some sites that are permanent, some sites that are transitory and specialist, population generally growing, perhaps as much as 2,500 people in this area of the west of Scotland. And here you've got a whole variety of sites, Steosnaig on Colonsay, sites like Fiskery Bay on Mull, various sites on Islay, people using different locations for different specialised activities. And at this time, probably a very high level of mobility, and people also using cave sites and things. And we've got this great concentration of caves around Oban. Sadly, very few of these caves surviving today because the discovery of the archaeology in this area was very much tied up with the development of the town, the opening up of the area, and the building of the distilleries and things. But here you can see a nice photograph of work at MacArthur Cave taking place in the 19th century. And you can see on the map a whole suite of sites around Oban. And we have to ask ourselves, were people targeting the coast? Did they find the coast a particularly appealing area to live? Or is it just that we haven't really found the evidence inland? And I would say probably the latter. I think if we could get below our deep deposits of peat, if we could get into our uplands in much more depth, we would find much more archaeological evidence there. And then we have a period where the climate gets much cooler, quite abruptly, really. It's often called the 8.2 blip or the 8.2 climatic downturn. It took place about 8,000 years ago. Here we've got sort of evidence of the impact on the landscape, perhaps between 7,800, 7,000 years ago. So, of course, there's a little bit of a knock-on effect between things getting cooler and the impact on the human population. But we know things get cooler, they get windier, it becomes very dry, it becomes much more difficult to live right across Scotland. Population doesn't go, we don't lose the Mesolithic completely, but population density does seem to drop. We've got far fewer sites from this period. Over on the west coast, sites like the rock shelter at An-Corran-on-Skye has evidence from this time. And we have got evidence up in the Cairngorms and along Deeside for this sort of period. So people aren't absent completely, but life certainly gets more difficult. And then recolonization, as things improve, population starts to rise again, perhaps having a more settled life. There's a lot of debate about the shell middens on Oronsay. You can see one of them here, whether people are living here year round, whether it's just frequent visitors, whether these are sites that happen to have survived here when others elsewhere have disappeared. But population gradually increasing again. And then we get to the period where we have the coming of farming. So we see our first farming sites, our first monuments and things, roughly around about 6,000 years ago. And massive change to life and society, change to the economic basis of life, the switch to farming animals, crops, changing the shape of the land, a reduction from the isotopic evidence. We can see less marine diet. People are tending to eat more meat, more terrestrial mammals and things. We see the construction of permanent settlements, the first monuments, population increases, the whole landscape changes. And there's been a lot of debate over the years whether this is kind of the local Mesolithic populations adopting farming or whether it's people bringing it in. And there's been a lot of good debate at conferences, fairly heated debate. I think the most recent genetic evidence, which is giving us an insight that we've never had before, it does suggest very much new groups moving into areas. So I'm afraid life gets rather difficult for our Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. They can no longer just go out and hunt. Because the landscape's changed, the sort of ecosystems that supported the animals, the wild animals on which they depended, they go. Life becomes much, much more difficult to become a hunter-gatherer. And so certainly within 1,000 years, probably within a much quicker period, maybe just a few centuries, all evidence archaeologically of everything that made you Mesolithic, that you would have identified with as a hunter-gatherer, that all goes. And really, life changes, we move into the Neolithic. And that's really just sort of getting to the end of the lecture. I just thought I would put in a plug for this little booklet. It's free online, made by the Matt Ritchie and team at Forestry and Environment Scotland. It's well worth having a look at it. It's got a lot of great text, not just about the Mesolithic, about lifestyles, about going out and sort of seeing the landscapes, thinking about what would have been available. It's also got information about how archaeologists draw their conclusions, how we go about doing our work. So really, it's a great resource. It's got some pointers as well for further research and further reading if you're interested. So I think, well worth, particularly as it's a free, nice free online resource, designed to be a fairly easy read with lots of interesting activities. Well worth exploring, particularly as we've got summer coming up ahead of us, certainly as I'm recording this lecture. And so hopefully it's given you a little bit of an idea of how people were living in the Mesolithic, the sort of things people might have been doing along the banks of the Dee, perhaps not so much information, or you can sort of get an idea that the landscape was very different. It wasn't the sort of neat, manicured farming landscape that we see today. You can think a little bit about that. Because this is a recorded lecture, you're probably watching it at a time where you can't ask me questions and things, but you can see my email address. There's plenty of places to find out more information about the Mesolithic, and hopefully that's just given you a little bit of enthusiasm for the period. It's been a very quick romp through it, but I'm always happy to talk about the Mesolithic, so thanks a lot.